It's now going to be time for Gerard to be in conversation with Lucy Powell, the Shadow Secretary of State for Education. Lucy is the Labour and Co-operative Member of Parliament for Manchester Central and since September 2015 the Shadow Secretary of State for Education. Born in Manchester, she attended a local comprehensive and sixth form college before going on to read chemistry at university. As Shadow Education Minister, Lucy has been a vocal opponent of the government's plans to forcibly academise all community primary and secondary schools and has called for the government to take action to address the shortage of teachers and the school places crisis. She has also pushed for more local oversight and accountability in schools, criticising the government's unnecessary and costly plans to overhaul the school system. Coming from a family of teachers and as a parent herself, Lucy is passionate about education and believes strongly in the importance of reducing inequality, raising aspirations and creating a productive economy by giving every child the best possible start in life. So, Conference, I ask you to welcome back Gerard and to welcome Lucy Powell, please.
Thank you, Kim, and welcome, Lucy.
Hello.
As you know, Lucy, we talked to Nick Gibb earlier,
Yep.
defending the government's white paper. Is there anything in it you like?
In the white paper, there's some little bits in there that I liked, some tiny little bits. But I think the devil will be in the detail even on those, I think. So there was a suggestion that, or there is a suggestion that local authorities will be given a greater role in terms of place planning and in terms of SEN placement and in-year admissions and so on. But then there was no detail on that, so we'll wait and see what that actually means. But there wasn't a great deal in there.
So on the whole, if it becomes law as it stands, you'll have no hesitation in recommending that your party repeals it, should you come to government?
Well, let's take one stage at a time. Obviously, what I'm working very hard on at the moment is to build a broad alliance to oppose many of the key measures in the white paper. That's my focus at the moment. I think the government needs to undertake a radical rethink of their plans, because it's not just me that's opposed to the forced academisation agenda. I'm sure many people here are opposed to it as well. Teachers, school leaders, parents, the National Governors Association, and now a growing number of Conservative council leaders and actually Conservative backbench MPs as well. So the government have got a long way to go until they can actually make some of these proposals become law. So my focus at the moment is to try and stop that happening in the first place.
So of the 17,000, almost 17,000 schools at the moment that are academies, which is about over 80% of primaries and about a third of secondaries, and I think a majority of special needs schools and PRUs. What would you say to those 17,000, any of those 17,000 that refused to convert? Would you say just, dig in your heels?
Well, what I would say to those schools is wait and see for this to actually become law, and see what type of law then actually emerges. Because as I say, I think that the government face a really big hurdle in getting this through the parliamentary process and through some of their backbenchers as well. And I know I know anecdotes already of MATs who've been phoned by 60 primary schools in the last 2 weeks, and lots of those sorts of examples where people are very quickly trying to protect themselves to find a local MAT or a MAT that they want to be part of to do that. So I would say definitely take your time. Let's see where we get to, because schools have got to find the right security and the right fit for them going forward.
Of course, the Academies programme seems like ancient history now, but it was started by Labour 12, 15 years ago. In retrospect, do you think it was a mistake?
I don't think it was a mistake. I think it was a very different programme. Obviously, what we did was we were focusing a huge amount of effort on a small number of schools that had persistently persistently struggled over many, many years and were in some of our most challenging parts of the country, in the middle of cities or coastal areas or whatever, where they'd struggled for many years. And the Academies programme back then, it came with a huge amount of additional support. So in nearly all cases, it came with a brand spanking new building. It came with extra resources. It came with new focus on leadership and support and a wider community buy-in and so on. So it was I think it was a very different agenda to the both the Converter Academy programme, but also very much the sort of forced academisation programme. I think maybe what we retrospectively I think didn't get right with that when we very first brought it in was the idea that somehow schools as an island was a successful model. We know that collaboration, working together as groups of schools, as an area of schools, and working together in collaboration is a key part of what makes a successful school. And so I think the idea of that school as an island is not the right approach. But our Academies programme, the academy part was only a very, very small part of a wider set of interventions to help turn those schools round. And in many cases it worked, and in some cases that didn't work either. So I think we have to learn the right lessons about what works.
So there's no suggestion that you would roll back the academy programme, should you?
Well,
but you just want to start.
Well, look, I mean, I think where I start from, a bit like, I mean, I do think the forced academisation programme that we're seeing the government come forward has got a lot of similarities with their recent top-down reorganisation of the NHS, where they brought in all these new clinical commissioning groups and so on, a complete unnecessary and costly reorganisation. I think it's got many, many similarities. And at the last election, we didn't go into that election saying we would reverse all those NHS changes because we felt the last thing the NHS would need is another reorganisation. So I don't want to say here now to the ATL and to parents and to others, what we're going to do is another costly reorganisations of the school system. But I'm really clear that I want all schools, whether they're academies, free schools, maintained schools or other schools, to have the same level of robust local oversight and local accountability. So I think it'll be about what we insert in the middle to ensure that schools have all got that same local oversight.
Because you have been reported in the past as saying that you'd like to bring free schools and academies under local authority control. Is that right? Or it's the difference between control and
I always use the word oversight because I think it's not about bringing back local authorities to sort of run all schools, but I think as very robust overseers, oversight. So I think in terms of financial probity, which we've seen many, many more scandals and so on growing up in terms of some of the academy chains. I think you've got to have that community interest test when it comes to a school's future. So are some of these academy chains, are they right for the local community? Are some of the free schools that we're seeing opening, are they right for the local area? So I want to see local authorities have a much stronger role in terms of place planning, for example, as well. So we'll develop this. We've got 4 years until the next election. But what I'm not going to do is say that we'll also have a costly reorganisation of the school system. I think that's probably the last thing everyone will want by that point in 5 years' time.
But of course, it could be a lot sooner if the Tory party insists on imploding. But anyway, let's just...
I know, but with well, if they choose to. But unfortunately, even with the new fixed-term Parliament Act that they brought in, even them imploding is a very unlikely thing that we'll have a general election anytime soon, I'm afraid.
Lucy, I think it's fair to say that many in the teaching unions were disappointed with your predecessors as Shadow Education Secretary because they didn't take a more robust stand against the government's reforms. Were they right to be frustrated with Labour's lack of leadership?
Well, I think I was frustrated too that education wasn't a bigger issue at the last election. I would have liked
it's not the same thing.
I know it's not quite the same thing. It's not quite the same thing, no. But well, I'm not here to sort of comment on my predecessors, and I'm sure you'll allow me the opportunity not to do that. But I have my own approach. I feel that I've been sort of taking the fight to the government on the issues that matter to me and matter to the teachers, but also parents as well. So I've spent most of my time in the last 6 months campaigning around teacher shortages and what's happening with teacher retention crisis, around place planning, because I think that's a really key issue as well. And then obviously now the white paper too, and we'll be leading the charge on those issues.
The Guardian has called you a Mancunian street fighter. So can delegates then expect a little more aggro for ministers?
Well, I think those who may record while they're teaching the education questions in Parliament will have seen a bit more street fighting going on there than in the past. But no, I am certainly Mancunian. I'm quite Mancunian.
Well, that's
I don't know if I'm a street fighter,
right.
but yeah.
Okay. Of course, there are many MATs. Ofsted found many MATs that were underperforming, and they said the failures were just as bad as local authority failures.
Worse, actually.
So what will you do if it was your Secretary of State? I know there's an awful lot of what would you do, but hey, you spent 4 years preparing for this job, so forgive the.
Well, I haven't spent 4 years yet.
Hypothetical. You will, well, if you're in post.
Yeah.
What would you do to bring underperforming MATs, raise the standards of underperforming MATs?
Well, look, certainly I think that MATs need to come under the same level of scrutiny that local authorities and others and schools come in under. So it was only because we were pushing that issue in terms of inspection of chains that Michael Wilshaw was able to go in recently, as he did, and look at the 7 worst performing chains. And I thought the letter he wrote to Nicky Morgan was absolutely sort of damning about their performance. So, you know, and when such reports transpire, we need to make sure that those MATs either can certainly not expand. I mean, I think one of the most shocking answers that we've got so far, we've only tip of the iceberg in terms of the parliamentary scrutiny of some of the government's white paper proposals, but Nicky Morgan couldn't even give an assurance that a MAT that is known to be poorly performing won't be given many more schools under her forced academisation programme. And I think what a terrible indictment of her policy that is, that she is willing to give away highly performing schools to underperforming chains just to meet her ideological aims and objectives. But I think we've got to make it a lot easier to take schools off these MATs and chains as well. I mean, there's an example that's just outside of my constituency of a chain that was given a school by Michael Gove 3 or 4 years ago, with lots of opposition locally, lots of opposition from the local authority. We knew it wasn't the correct fit for that school. It's not only has it not improved that school, it's actually got worse and worse and worse. But there's no one who's got the powers at the moment to take that school back away from that chain. So that decoupling kind of process, if you like. So we inserted again in the last piece of legislation that's just become an act, the Children and Families Act, we put down amendments there to make sure that this coasting definition could also apply to academies. So there are now some powers for the government to do that, but I think they act too slowly in doing that, and they seem to give multi-academy trusts a lot longer dealing with failure than they would give an LA school.
What about pay? Of course, academies have the freedom to set their own pay rates. Could you envisage a Labour government abolishing that power?
Well, I think the biggest victims of that, in my experience at the moment, have been support staff, actually, because they seem to get a much worse deal.
So you bring back the SSSN and B, whatever it is?
Well, I don't know exactly at the moment, but we'll certainly keep a very close eye on these issues. I mean, I think at the moment, because there is such a shortage of teachers, we might see an upward move on teacher pay, because that is what a lot of schools are having to do. But it's support staff who I think are seeing quite a downward pressure on their wages. So obviously we've got to support people's ability to sort of live and work and do that. So we'll look carefully at those issues and see what is actually happening.
So it's 2020, you're Secretary of State for Education. What would your priorities be in the way for education white paper?
Well, the first thing, I'm not going to sort of come in with my own set of pet subjects, you'll be pleased to know, and say, right, this is how I want everything doing. But I think, my job as Secretary of State is to not micromanage what's happening in the classroom, but to set a strategic direction for education over a period of time. So a couple of my priorities will be, one, I want to put an extra focus on the early years, because I think we could do a lot more narrowing the gap between children even arrive at school, and I think schools have got a role to play in that. You look dubious.
No.
I think at the moment there's actually a disincentive for schools to play a role in children arriving at school better. You hear anecdotes and so on of schools saying, well, we like them to arrive not very well developed because then we can get the value added at school. Well, that obviously can't be the right approach. I think we could do a lot more to support those early years, and I have a stronger focus on post-16 education as well, because I think that's been the poor relation over the last few years in particular.
What about grammars?
Grammar schools. Our policy remains the same on grammar schools.
Yeah, I forgot what it is, Lucy, remind me.
Okay, so there'll be no new grammar schools, no expansion of grammar schools, and it will be for kind of local parents to determine whether they want their school to remain
But
a grammar school.
all the evidence suggests that grammars disproportionately affect adversely disadvantaged kids, simply because very few, 2%, are on free school meals. The gap between people on free school meals and those not on free school meals in grammar school areas is wider than it ever is in the rest of the country. Surely, as a Labour government, shouldn't you do something if the evidence is so clear that actually grammars are bad for disadvantaged kids?
Yeah, well, and we'll look at those things. I always say we'll look at those things. But I mean, look, I think what the government's been doing, and I've been very vocal about this, in terms of allowing grammar schools to expand.
Yeah.
So we've seen the first new grammar school opening in decades in Kent, and there are many more coming up the track through the Free Schools programme, through other means, through multi-academy trusts now as well. We will see an expansion of the selection under this government, and I think that gives us a really good rallying point to come back to some of these arguments about grammar schools, because you're absolutely right, at grammar schools, that these are not vehicles of social mobility. Because under the last Labour government, even though grammars weren't allowed to expand, the numbers actually studying in grammar schools increased, I think, by a third. I don't know if it was quite that high, but I mean, there was a proportionate...
Yeah, there was a big...
There was a pupil growth across the piece, generally, and obviously grammars. And I think so probably in hindsight, our legislation on grammar schools could have put more powers there to bring about some changes to grammar schools. But we'll look, as I say, I think over the next few years we are going to see a massive expansion in grammar schools. So that, I think that gives us a whole new reason to look at these issues again and to look at our own policies again. But it's totally unacceptable that you have a situation where grammar schools have got percentages of free school meals children on less than 3%, some are like 1%, 1.5%, when their localities that they serve have got an average free school meal intake of around 20%. So those statistics are absolutely shocking. And in taking those arguments to Conservatives, as I have been over the last few months, it has led to some of those Conservative local authority areas looking at how they can redress that balance, because that is an appalling record and one that cannot be sustained in an era of any grammar schools. But look, I mean, I would never send my kids to grammar schools. I believe in the comprehensive education system. I think that not only is that a good thing for kids in life, but actually, a bright kid at a good comprehensive school does just as well, if not even better, than bright kids at grammar schools. There's no evidence that being at a grammar school is any better for you than being at an outstanding comprehensive school. And I would say that you actually get a lot more from being in a school environment where you are with a mix of kids of all backgrounds and all abilities, and it teaches you a lot more about life, and that's what I believe in. So.
And what about independent schools? Do you think they do enough to justify their charitable status? If not, what would a Labour government do about it?
Well, some do and some don't. I think that's the truth of it. And I think those that don't need to do more to justify it, absolutely.
So you'd be happy to see more who don't do enough to lose their charitable status?
Well, I think there needs to be a bit more carrot and stick in that mix. I think, in this environment where schools are facing
tell me about the stick.
Tell me about the stick. you're picking all these obscure sort of issues that journalists always like to talk to you about. What about, like, you know, what's happening in the classroom?
We'll get on to that in a minute.
Okay. Well, I mean, look, in my constituency is Manchester Grammar School, right? It's one of the leading independent schools. They have a third of their children, or nearly a third of the kids at that school would qualify for free school meals, which is it's miles better than most of the grammar schools that you're talking about. And they also open up their facilities to local schools and that kind of thing. So I think that's...
There are good exemplars.
There are good exemplars,
Okay.
and I think that should be the bar set for everybody. And obviously you've got to have measures in place if people don't meet that bar.
Okay, fine. Recruitment.
Yep.
What would Labour do? Obviously, we have a real recruitment problem, a challenge. Nick Gibb calls it a crisis.
That's the
for
first time
people.
I've heard him even admit there was any problem. He gets really antsy about it.
Well, he did admit there was an issue. Let's put it like that.
There was an issue. Right.
So how would Labour make teaching a more attractive profession?
Well, I don't think it's a simple answer, really. I mean, obviously there are issues around recruitment. I think the recruitment process has become too complex, and graduates don't know which pathway is necessarily going to work for them. And I think you've been hearing at your conference this morning already just about some of those different experiences that people have in terms of that recruitment pathway. So we've got to make it a more attractive profession to join. Obviously, retention is a really, really key issue at the moment. And again, I don't think that's a simple answer. Part of that is around workload. Part of that, I think, is around the constant sort of chopping and changing of assessments, of exams, of how schools and teachers are measured, and that just changes daily at the moment, doesn't it, with all the new clarifications coming up on the website. It's impossible to sort of work around. And, you know, obviously pay and conditions is part of that as well. I think when you've had a pay freeze, as we've had over the last few years, then you're not seeing that sort of progression. It's not.
So that'd be one of the priorities, would it?
Well, it's not. It's part of a package. You've got to look at financial incentives as well, and I think we've got to look at creative financial incentives about attracting teachers back to the profession. I think there's many teachers now who are only a few years out of teaching, who are still very much classroom ready and could come back in the classroom, and I think we've got to find ways to encourage them to come back in. And I do think as well we should perhaps look at sometimes teaching being a bit more flexible. I always think as a woman who's campaigned a lot in my political career for greater flexibility in the workplace, a greater appreciation of the fact that we are parents as well as employees, that I still hear too many stories about how schools aren't offering teachers part-time work and that kind of thing as well. So I think there's a whole range of things we could and should be looking at. But I think what I always say about this is you can't have a strategy about a teacher shortage problem if you don't accept there's a problem in the first place. So you've got to accept there's a problem, and then you have a strategy to deal with it.
Well, there's a challenge now.
There's a challenge.
There's a challenge now.
Okay,
there's a challenge. You mentioned you were from a family of teachers. Did you ever consider becoming a teacher?
Well, no, because they always used to tell me not to do it because it's a nightmare.
Do you want to share with conference why was that?
Well, so my mum was a teacher and a head. My grandparents were teachers. My mum's sisters and all my aunts and uncles.
So you're the black
teachers,
sheep then?
Are head teachers. Well, my dad wasn't a teacher.
Right. Okay.
He's a social worker in children's services. So yeah, and they're either now sort of working as my mum's a governor. I think she's a pain in the bum governor at a couple of schools. It's best as you need those governors. You need those governors. So yeah, so I am not short of unsolicited advice about what's happening in education. You can be reassured about that.
One of the reasons teachers are leaving the profession, according to an ATL survey, was the increase in workload. Who do you think is to blame?
Well, there's certainly government. I think quite a lot to blame for that. Again, I think
do you have any thoughts how you'd reduce it?
Well, look, I think what you shouldn't do as a government minister is think that it's your job to sit there micromanaging the curriculum and changing all the assessments.
You're about to tell
all the
conference
time.
you don't know the difference between a fronted adverbial and a modal verb.
We were talking about that
beforehand.
We were, but I really don't.
Right.
Obviously, I was educated in the 1980s, so
right.
It wasn't. My grammar's not the best. I'm all right at maths, but I'm No, my grandma's not. I wouldn't
Right.
even know what half those things meant. But, you know, I mean, I've got kids myself. I've got one in year 7, one in year 1 and one at nursery. And the year 1 curriculum, it's just absolutely mad. It is absurd. It is absurd. But so, as I say, I think my job is to set the strategic direction, and I think it's the profession's job to work out how to best to deliver that strategy. And you've got to look at the evidence, and you've got to allow things to bed in and then review them and then adjust them if necessary. But I think constantly changing things all the time, how can anyone evaluate the success or value or otherwise of those changes? I can't see that.
Do you think, I asked this question of Nick, so I think it's only fair I ask it of you, Lucy. Do you think teachers complain too much?
No, I don't think teachers complain
No?
too much. No.
They should whinge more.
Yeah. It's always the head teacher at both my kids' secondary school and my kids' primary school. I think quite a lot of other teachers always say to them, God, it must be a nightmare having a shadow secretary of state as a parent at your school. And don't all the teachers sort of use parents' evening as an opportunity to sort of say all these things? So I had the parents' evenings just before
And
Easter.
do they?
But they don't actually. No, they don't, to be fair. I more ask them. I say, oh, how are you finding this new curriculum? No, I don't think. I think teachers do brilliant jobs. They really do fantastic, amazing jobs. And I think you see the value of great education, especially in a constituency like mine, where we've got like 50% child poverty, and what the levels that the kids get to at schools in my constituency is incredible. So I would never do the job of a teacher. I think it's way too hard.
It's a lot easier being a politician.
So,
okay.
yeah.
Okay. Ofsted, let's turn to Ofsted a bit. We haven't
Okay.
talked about them yet. What would you do with it?
Well, look, I mean, I think I always say this, it never goes down well in these audiences, so just precursor what I'm saying with that. I mean, I do think that a system of accountability is an important system to have in schools. You know, I went to school in the 1980s, where yes, I had some brilliant teachers. I also had some terrible teachers, but there was no system. There was no systematic way of making sure that me or my peers did okay at school, and many of them failed. I was kind of one of the lucky ones. I sort of opted in and I did okay. And I think that having a system of monitoring and of assessing that is an important system to have in place. And I do think Ofsted and the existence of Ofsted has been part of driving that, driving some system changes through. Now, is it currently fit for purpose? I think is a valid question, and a question that we would ask, we should ask. Is it reached too far? Has it got the right people in place to be able to make the kind of assessments that it's there to make? Could its role be more supportive than it currently is, rather than just marking your homework, so to speak? Yeah, I think they're all valid things to look at and ask questions about.
As you know, Sir Michael Wilshaw's term ends this year. The government is currently advertising for a new chief inspector. What qualities and skills would you like to see in the new chief inspector?
Well, I think it should be someone who comes from the profession.
Uh-huh.
I think it should be someone who is prepared to say things that people might not want to hear, and that includes the government. So I don't think the government should go down the route of...
Because the government, of course, is reported not to have been best pleased with Sir Michael's latest interventions, but you think it's important that...
Well, I think it is important that they should be able to speak without fear or favour, whether that is about sending tough messages to the Labour Party or to the current government or to teachers or to others. They should be able to speak without fear or favour, even if some of us don't like what they've got.
So if you got a letter like Nikki got from Sir Michael, you know, a few years hence, assuming you're in the role, you wouldn't take umbrage with anything. Absolutely right, he's doing his job. Yeah. Or her job. Yeah.
Well, I would like to think so.
Yeah, okay.
I would like to think so.
And what about RSCs? Do you think Labour will keep them?
Well, I think they've got an impossible job. I really do think they've got a completely impossible job. I know, I mean, I don't know all of the RSCs. I met I met the Northwest one actually last week.
Do you mean impossible as a kind of hopeless, or so impossible that they need more resources?
I think impossible, even with loads of resources, because
They're superfluous.
Well, I don't know that they're totally superfluous.
Right.
But I don't think you can be the check and balance and the school improvement partner across an entire region for thousands and thousands of schools. And I don't think that that role, as it exists, does have the community interest at its core, which is where I think the balance has totally gone out of the system. There is nobody for whose job it is. So one of the things I discussed with Vicky Beer on Friday, for example, was this latest example in Knowsley, where Knowsley is about to lose the last bit of A-level provision that it has in the entire local authority. Now, if you're, whose job is it to say, actually, kids in an area need to be able to access A-level education. They shouldn't have to get 2 or 3 buses out of their area to be able to do A-levels. If your job is to simply sort of look at school improvement, is that provision any good? Is it just to look at how can we pair up maths and pair up schools with maths and the sort of job that they have? They don't have the job that says, what are the needs of this local community and how can they be best served? It's a different job. So you've got to have local government, as an
That's the oversight role you were talking about.
As a key player in that. Now it may be that they work with a sort of schools-led system as well in terms of school improvement by that point. I don't know, but we'll see. But I just think they've got an impossible job.
Let's just turn to the curriculum and assessment areas. You've said in the past you've seen the benefits that more rigorous testing has had on your 11-year-old son, I think it was in The Guardian. You said that the framework of testing has hugely improved standards over the past 20 years. So do you approve of the latest reforms to Key Stage 2, GCSE, A-levels, all the rest of it?
Well, I think they're coming in way too quickly and they're not necessarily got a strong evidence base. So I don't know what was wrong with the old SATs. I don't know what was wrong with levels. I kind of understood levels as a parent. I don't think any parent knows what's going on at the moment. I'm not sure that lots of teachers know what's going on in terms of levels, for example. The new GCSEs and A-levels, there's less than, I asked this question in Parliament 2 or 3 weeks ago, less than half of the GCSEs that are supposed to be being taught in September have yet been signed off and agreed by ministers and others. So we're way behind in that. So I think there's too much change too
It's the implementation rather than the intent.
Well, I'm not even sure that the intent has got the right evidence base. So if I give you an example, the new maths GCSE, I think the government's approach to sort of making it dead hard and making everything harder and more robust is just about broadening the curriculum and adding on another sort of third onto the maths curriculum at GCSE. As somebody who's, studied, I think I'm the only person in the shadow cabinet or the cabinet who's actually got a science degree, by the way. So I think it just sort of shows you that we've been really criticised for that broadening of the maths curriculum, because if you look at our international competitors, whether they're in Asia or even in Germany or Poland, where they're doing really well in maths, they actually have a much narrower curriculum that is more concept driven, and it's about teaching kids the concepts of maths and how to apply that across a whole range of problems. And the OECD have massively criticised the government's new maths curriculum. Now, maths is a really important subject, obviously, but it's going to be even more important as we enter this digital, automated world of the future, and computing and so on. Maths is critical to that. And I think the government are letting the next generation down in messing about with the curriculum in a way that goes against the evidence. So it's both what they're trying to... I think, Nick Gibb and Michael Gove before him have a very narrow view about what is hard and what, let's just make things dead hard. And I don't think they really understand the subjects well enough, which is why it's not their job, really, to be honest with you. I don't think curriculum should just be the job of government.
So your instincts would be to leave it to the profession the same way that clinical advice, for instance, is left to the medical profession.
Yeah, and I think, look, curriculum is something that should be owned more broadly by society, and obviously as an elected democracy, there is a role there for government to have in broad curriculum development. But you've got to also make sure you've got experts and the teachers and other experts absolutely at the heart of that development. And I think the government's role is about setting a direction of travel. What are our challenges of the future? How are we going to meet those challenges? What do we need to look at? And you've got to draw on evidence. You've got to then test things out and have time to embed them and then review them. And I think that's a more sensible way to approach these things than just having your own narrow experience about what you think, where you think an exclamation mark, for example, should be used in a sentence, and then write that to the curriculum. I mean, my daughter, as I was going to say earlier, my daughter's year 1 curriculum that you get given at the parents' evening is like 9 or 10 pages long of really obscure things, which I'm not quite sure who that's helping really.
You mentioned that you were one of the few female politicians actually one of the few politicians with the science background. Of course, there was a famous female politician who was also a chemist who went on to do big things.
She was shadow with the same star sign as well.
Yeah, well,
went to the same college.
It's destiny, it's destiny, Lucy.
Yeah.
But
That's where it ends.
and you also mentioned a very surprising fact. You're the first Labour member of Parliament for Manchester.
Yeah, who's a
woman.
woman.
Female, which is incredible and
is.
rather shameful.
It is very shameful.
But anyway, coming back to the classroom, you're obviously concerned as a woman and as a scientist about women's opportunity to do well in science. What would you do to address the imbalance? Because all the evidence shows that there's absolutely no difference in the capability of boys and girls to do STEM subjects, yet we have this huge imbalance with girls just dropping out of science at 14. What would you do to
and it
address
has
that?
ever been the case, obviously, and is not getting any better. I mean, when I did my A-levels, I did maths and further maths. I was the only girl in the maths class. And in my physics class, there was 2 girls out of about 20, and all the boys had got a C at their GCSE, and we'd got like sort of top grade A's to get in the physics class, and I think that's the same now. So, I mean, look, these are big challenges. We've got to have role models. I think it's about culture. It's about giving young women the experiences as to what sort of jobs they could do with those kind of skills as well. Obviously, the complete obliteration of career service has not really helped in terms of that, and work experience having gone as well. So I think you've got to look at these things in the round, and we should have a real focus on it. It's a really important area.
Before we end, there's a few topics I didn't get the chance to talk to Nick Gibb about. One of which was PSHE.
Oh yeah.
The government refuses to make it.
Well, we said 2 or 3 weeks ago that we absolutely will make PSHE compulsory in all schools. I think I know it contradicts what I was just saying about curriculum, but I do think it's one of those areas of saying it's really important that we have this time in the curriculum for young people to explore issues that they need to explore. And I think that partly because it's not been compulsory as well is why the curriculum for PSHE is so out of date. It was last updated in the year 2000. I mean, before the onset really of the internet, of sexting, of all these issues around radicalisation and a whole range of issues. I think for child mental health and well-being, there's a lot of areas there that I think kids would benefit from having some dedicated time in the curriculum to explore. But also we've got to equip teachers with the resources, the time, the training and the support that they need in order to explore some of these quite scary subjects, really. I think it's quite a sort of scary world out there now for kids.
Yeah, with sexting. Yeah. One other area, shamefully, we haven't talked about with either of you until now is further education. And the further education sector is having huge issues with funding, losing student share to sixth form colleges and schools and all the rest of it. What would Labour do to revitalise the FE sector?
Well, again, I don't think it's an easy challenge, but with real focus, I think we can do that. So firstly, obviously, I think making sure it's not the poor relation in terms of resourcing. We've seen huge cuts to post-16. That's not just affected FE, it's affected sixth form colleges, school sixth forms as well as sixth form colleges, and made it a real challenge. And if you look at the sort of graph of how much money we spend sort of per pupil through their childhood, through their whole education career, it's very, very little sort of preschool. It's obviously pretty steady while they're at school. It goes right down post-16 to 19 and then goes right back up through the roof when they get to sort of university, when we spend a lot of money on them there. So I think we've got to look at those issues and where that proportion lies, obviously, so resources is a key part of that. I think we've got to look again at what some of the things that we offer in FE. I think we could have a greater correlation between supply and demand, for example, and clearer pathways into work with real quality offerings, vocational and apprenticeships, as well as I do think that kids should do maths and English till they're 18, not necessarily GCSEs, resitting them through till they're 18, but do maths and English.
So that's one government initiative you would keep?
They're
keeping kids doing maths and English to the
well,
age of 18.
yeah, George Osborne said in the budget that he wanted kids to do maths till they're 18.
Right.
I've no problem with that as a principle, but when you've got a chronic shortage of maths teachers in particular, who's going to actually deliver that policy? So there's no point having a policy if it's totally undeliverable. You've got to get that right first.
Thank you, Lucy. I think Kim, subtly sitting behind me, is basically suggesting that our time has come to an end. Thank you very much for turning up, Lucy. And thank you, colleagues. Thanks.
Thank you.
That's nice.
Thank you.